All right, welcome everybody. In today's section, we're going to get into the management module. And really, the information kind of discussed in this module relates to kind of understanding how management plays into supporting a successful lean organization and how it can further support a lean transformation. So when we talk about lean management, there's really two key questions that come up. The first is, what is it? The second, obviously, is how do we actually use it? And in the context of the Lean Context program, how we deal with those is, the first one is addressing what it is by discussing the role of lean management. The second one, in understanding how we use it, we go through some material relating to the fundamentals of lean management. That comes up in the next section. And really what these two sections relate to is understanding and then actual skills. And when we can marry the knowledge with the skills in terms of how to actually use it and understand its purpose, then that's how we can actually create an effective management regimen to support a lean transformation. So in the first section, we're going to be focusing on the role of lean management. And in talking about that, really what we need to do, the very first thing is we need to be able to create a vision of the ideal condition. And when we talk about that, really all we mean is understanding right now at this moment what can we do versus in an ideal world what should we do. And what that translates to in terms of an actual organization, an actual setting, is the what can we do is understanding what's our current condition right now. And the what should we do is really being able to develop that sense of what an ideal condition is. What would be perfect in a perfect world if we could achieve, right? What's our reach for the stars goal? What is perfect? And in a lean sense, in an organizational context, what that really means is kind of two key things, right? First is in terms of customer first thinking. Obviously, we want 0 defects, 100% efficiency, and 100% on-time delivery, right? Perfect world, perfect results. The other side of it, which is important to understand from a management role, is the human development side, right? We want to be able to provide career opportunities, development opportunities, job security through a successful and robust organization. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, we want to make sure that we're providing a safe work environment for our team members. And what we want to do from management is we want to be able to leverage the vast human resource of our organization and be able to direct it so that every person is spending every minute of every day on the same page, working together as an cohesive organization to take us from our current condition to our ideal condition, right? That's the role of management in terms of continuous improvement and a lean transformation. So the first thing we want to do is we need to be able to develop the culture that can get us there to do that. And the first thing that comes out of that is being able to develop a shop floor that can manage itself. Now, shop floor is in quotation marks because, in a typical manufacturing sense, that's the factory floor, that's where the value is added. But it really can be anything. It can be, it can be a school, an office building, it can be a hospital, it could be a grocery store, right? Shop floor really is just representative of the part of the organization that adds value, creates product, it develops it, whatever it is that the entity exists to produce. And so we want to understand, how do we actually accomplish this? Well, there's a couple different ways that we do that. The first one is we want to create a need so that there's a need for the shop floor to manage itself. We need to have systems in place to be able to respond to that. We want to make sure that we're motivating our team members and actually structuring the way our organization works to be able to achieve that ideal. And then the last thing is we're going to have a quick discussion on kind of the ideal thinking in terms of understanding organizational culture, especially in a lean context. And to go back for just a second, one of the reasons why it's important for the shop floor to manage itself, why this is one of the first things that we talk about, is in order to create an environment where there's a sense of urgency in responding to problems. It's one of the big things we talked about in the previous module. A sense of urgency to respond to problems, to be able to understand, how things should be working, to see ahead behind condition and address these problems, and to be engaged in providing creative new solutions to problems. That all needs to come from the ground up. We covered that in some of the philosophy sections. And so to put that capability in the hands of the people on the front line, our team members, the ones that are adding value, we need to create an environment as managers where they have the opportunity and they're empowered to actually manage themselves to address these issues. That's why this is so important, especially understanding as managers how we can help support that. So the first thing is creating the need. And this is just a generic kind of representation. But if you assume that we have some current demand level, and then some business condition has changed and now we have an elevated demand level. Now the typical understanding of that is to say our sales went up. So that's the demand. Now we need to make more product. It could also be that the demand is coming from a desire to reduce cost, right? So in that case, the demand is, our margins are too slim. So the drive there, the demand is to expand margins. So this is just kind of a generic representation, but the key thought out of here is whenever demand increases, we don't want to increase capacity to match that, right? We want to create that pressure of being able to make some changes to satisfy this new goal is creating the need to, put in place some of these lean systems, right? So don't increase capacity, just increase efficiency. That's going to be our focus. And the way we do that through some of the other tools that we've already discussed, talking about OA improvement and reducing waste from the philosophy section, those concepts. Kaizen is the same thing, continuous improvement, making these improvements to improve efficiency and reduce waste. And when we focus on that, what that does is kind of three things, really. It brings us closer to the ideal. It also reduces our costs and increases our profit, which is always a good thing, especially if that's the driver of demand. And then the last part is those activities, those exercises, increase the human capability of the human resource within the organization, right? Practice makes perfect. And solving these challenges and being involved in improving this efficiency engages our people and levels up their capability for future activity, which is very, very vital. So once we've created that need by responding to an increase in demand by focusing on efficiency instead of just adding capacity, now we need to respond to it. And what we find normally is when we start focusing on efficiency instead of just hiring more people or losing margin or throwing more parts and more supplies and more resources at it, when we focus on efficiency, that brings all of these problems up to the surface. We start seeing all of these issues, part shortages, quality problems, whatever it could be. And then what we need to do now is we need to have some urgency to actually correct this stuff. That's how we start making improvements. And so the shop floor needs to be able to manage itself so that it can solve these problems urgently, meet that sense of urgency. And then it also needs to have some role of autonomy in developing its team members to be able to respond to these situations, right? That flexibility, a nimble organization. When a shop floor can manage itself, now you can level up all the team members out there so that they can handle any type of adverse situation. We don't have as many shutdowns or slowdowns or problems that don't get addressed. So one of the ways that we do this, we solve these problems, again going back to the problem solving module, is effective problem solving. So we can put some tools in place so that we can see the problem, right? We're focusing on it, we're exposing the problems now. Then the next thing we need to do is be able to solve them. Find the point of occurrence, find the root cause, solve our problems one by one, right? Continuously making progress on addressing these issues systematically. The other side that comes out of it is when people are actively solving problems and they're solving them effectively, we can use that problem-solving experience to develop the capability of our people. And the key thought that comes out of that, and we've hit on it a few times, is that for an organization, it gets the maximum benefit when everybody within that organization is competent, capable problem solvers, right? You can leverage the full breadth of that resource for maximum benefit. So that kind of ties into developing team members in terms of problem-solving skills, being able to manage themselves kind of as a system. And so there's kind of two ways to do that. One is the short term, when people first come in, new hires, transfers, and then the long term we'll talk about a little bit later on. But first, in terms of short-term people, what we want to do is for our management structure, we want to have a concept of a team leader. It could be a manager, a group leader, whatever the terminology is within the organization. It's really the concept that's important. And what that team leader does is that when you bring a new individual in, short term, that team leader then is capable of directly supporting that person to help them level up their skills, to make sure that they're not falling behind, to support them until they're capable of meeting the responsibilities of that position in a regular fashion. And then this, in terms of supporting the team leaders, it's kind of an important concept because it deals with how we view kind of sequential layers of management. So if we say that the group leader is the next layer of management above the team leaders, right? The group leader's role then is to be able to work with team leaders to solve problems and support them. And so the key takeaway from this is that each level of management we go up, the way that manager views their subordinates doesn't change. Just because you're a vice president doesn't mean that you interact with your regional managers any differently than those regional managers interact, with their local reps. The role of the supervisor, the role of the manager is not to micromanage, is not to dictate, it's to be involved in supporting their team members, right? That kind of ground up philosophy. So that's kind of the key role that we want to take away from this section. So now, in the long-term sense, what we really want to do, and it ties in very nicely, the team leader needs to create a full cross-functional skill set with all of his team members, right? So it becomes plug and play. If someone's sick or absent or you have to shuffle people around, you're not limited by which individuals can perform what tasks, right? We have a complete, flexible, nimble organization. Cross-training programs are difficult. Sometimes there are some legitimate barriers that take some nuance to overcome, but it's the thinking, it's the goal, it's that striving for the ideal that's important. We want to have flexible team members because that provides us the most leverage in being able to respond to problems. Same thing then for the group leader or the manager, the vice president or the president. As a manager, we want to make sure that all of our subordinates are cross-trained successfully and well enough that they can replace each other in case of an issue or a problem. And there's kind of two main things that come out of that, which are very, very beneficial. And I'm sure that a lot of you have experienced this. So the first thing is, when we have good cross-training in place, it creates kind of a broader understanding of how the organization works, right? An individual from this station over here now understands what the individual down there does. It makes it a little bit easier for problem solving. It makes it a little bit easier now to manage issues, quality problems, things like that, and build teamwork when people can relate to each other's experiences. The second part there, again, and we've kind of touched on it before, is it creates a lot of flexibility. And the big thing is being able to quickly learn new things. So when you have a broad skill set, when you have a developed human resource pool, now when you make a change, a process change, a product change, a model change, a new management directive, people are more comfortable and more able to respond to that in a positive, effective way because they have a broader skill set of tools to be able to use in these new situations. So then we want to look at kind of how do we actually develop this thinking, develop these resources for management, from being able to develop these cross-functional teams, things like that. And one of the things we use is something just called the Cascade method. So in a hypothetical organization, if you kind of broke the management down, top, middle, and floor, what we want to do is we want to start at the top. And by this kind of iterative process of doing an action, doing an activity, reflecting on what we learned, and then doing it again, kind of that continuous improvement cycle, we kind of chain together from top to bottom. So through interactions with top management to middle management and middle management to floor management, we kind of want to cascade that learning and knowledge down from the top. Because if we start at the bottom and we're not having good understanding from the top, it creates a lot of friction, a lot of tension. So if we can start at the top and cascade it down, we can make sure that all the critical individuals and key people are on the same page as we move forward so that we can do it together. So then this third section that we're going to talk about, we've created that need, we're developing our management capability, developing our human resource to be able to respond to this need now. Now we need to be able to strive to the ideal. And the first thing we want to do is understand kind of accurate motivation, being able to understand where we really stand. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some additional support structures that we can add to an organization to help support kind of this efficiency focus. And really, these two things tie directly into supporting the shop floor, providing them the information they need to act, and then providing the support and the help they need to act successfully. So the first thing in terms of accurate motivation, one of the things that we find is a lot of organizations collect some data on their day-to-day performance. What we also find is that data doesn't necessarily really accurately reflect what is happening on the shop floor. So that's what we talk about true performance indicators, right? We want to actually see what's happening and make sure that those indicators are capturing the waste, not excluding it and kind of artificially inflating the numbers. Not through malfeasance, just through the way we're collecting it. So we'll take an example of production efficiency. It's something that a lot of people keep, so it's kind of a good generic example. So we'll define efficiency just as the amount of time per unit times the number of units produced divided by the total hours it took us to do it, right? So in this example, it takes a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes to build each unit. We build 50 of them at a time, and it takes the line 13 hours to build those 50. So then we plug that into our formula, that yields production efficiency of 96%, which is pretty good. I think a lot of you out there, certainly myself, if I looked at this, would be pretty pleased with that. That's a very good number. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that that is actually representing what's really happening. So let's kind of break it down into those component pieces of unit time, of total units produced, and of total labor time. So looking first at unit time, with a traditional sense where you've got one individual, one team member working at a machine, you may have that team member does some things, sets up the machine, then hits the machine and lets it run. So that total time, the human time and the time the machine is running, is that quarter of an hour. Right? But there's some wait time there where they're waiting on the machine to run. So what we want to do with capturing the full picture is we just want to focus on the time that the team member is working, right? Because when the machine's running, that individual could be doing other work. We want to separate man's work from machine's work. So when we look at it a little bit closer, we find out that really it only requires 1/8 of an hour, so half that time for the individual to be working there. The other time they're just waiting. And that's kind of the difference between one individual working just one machine or one individual working several different machines, right? To kind of optimize that human time. The next thing we'll look at is units produced. So in a traditional sense, we may say that between what we shipped, what we had to scrap, and what we had to rework, we got 50 total units, right? 50 units came off the end of the line. Some of them went to scrap, some of them were shipped, some of them were reworked, but 50 is what came off the line, so we produced 50 that day. With lean thinking, we just want to focus on what we actually ship, because if we have to scrap it or rework it, that doesn't count as a good product we produced. If we do count those, we're kind of inflating our numbers a little bit. And then the last thing is total hours worked. In a traditional sense, we would look at, okay, what is the labor time that those team members on the line spent? That direct labor only. That's where we got the 13 hours from the example. But with lean thinking, we want to look at the total system time that goes into building that product. So if there's someone from materials that is allocated to that line, that they are supporting that directly, their time needs to be included. The people in shipping, the people in the front office, however we can allocate time to understand what is really, how much time we're really spending on producing these products, that's what we want to capture, not just the direct stuff. And the reason why that's important is we'll see kind of a striking difference. With traditional thinking, where they're waiting on the machine, where we don't really take into account anything that was scrapped or reworked, only what came off the line, and when we're only looking at direct labor, we may go, that's 96%, that's fantastic, we don't need to improve anything. But then when we look at how much time we're actually spending, right, we pull out that wait time. We look at what we're actually shipping. We pull out the rework or the scrap. And then we look at all the time that the supporting cast is putting in. Now we find out that our true, real efficiency is only 31%. And that's a substantial difference, which is why it's important to make sure we capture this full picture. So we have an accurate understanding of where we are now, so we can compare it to that ideal situation and help get everyone on board about why we want to move forward. And again, we can look at it that way and say, how close are we really? So then the second thing we kind of wanted to talk about is, one, we want to make sure we got accurate motivation. We have good data. We know where we stand. We know where we want to go. The second thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually have a support structure in place to kind of help the shop floor make sure that they can implement some of these changes and that they can stay focused on efficiency. And so if we just take a sample organization, this is kind of a big one where you've kind of got the first three boxes there, the executive management, and then you actually have kind of the production area, the actual individuals on the shop floor that are producing, adding value, and then the supporting cast to it. The support structure we want to add is a lean office. Now, depending on the size of the organization, this is obviously going to determine the size of this office, but it's not the size or the shape it takes, it's the thinking and the understanding of what value it adds and why it's important to add that. And what it does is it supports production directly. It doesn't really interact in kind of different roles within the organization. It is a direct support structure. And kind of the key roles out of it is the planning side of it is being able to develop that ideal condition, right? Working with with management, working with production, let's understand what's the ideal condition. What are we striving for here? And then the second side of it is a Kaizen team, where you've got individuals from different areas that are dedicated to finding waste and putting these improvements, developing these improvements, and working on kind of continuous and sustainable improvement activities, right? And the reason why we want to have this as a support structure is if we're going to seriously focus on improving efficiency, and we're going to seriously focus on making an effort to implement this and to develop a lean organization and to go on that journey, we can't rely on pulling people away from their full-time jobs to try and get them to be involved in this, right? We need to make sure that we have adequate support so that we can get through these hurdles and break through these barriers as they occur. And this is a key thing. When we talk about getting into lean, there are some instances where we need to add some resources sometimes to make sure that we have adequate support to stay on the right path. Again, this is kind of the value of that lean office. We talked a little bit about it on the last slide, but this gets into it a little bit more. And kind of the main goals of what we want to do with it is, focus on stability and efficiency. Have an entity within the organization that is their primary concern. Not putting out fires, not sitting in board meetings, not filling out reports, focusing on efficiency and stability. What comes out of that then is now you have a resource that can kind of support putting in accountability and discipline to manage these lean systems once they go in place, because we've got to inspect what we expect, and if we don't audit ourselves, if we don't confirm our expectations, it's difficult to sustain improvements that we need. So we're putting in place a resource to address that specifically. And then the last thing is technical support. So if you've got an individual or you have a problem-solving group and they're working on developing a solution and they have questions, now we have an internal resource. We have experts that they can go ask that can get involved to help support them directly. Then the other side of it, and this kind of comes from the Kaizen team side of it, is human development. When we're pulling people from different areas of the organization to be on this team, now you have an opportunity to kind of develop knowledge, develop new skills, and share it throughout the organization because they're involved in different projects and come from different areas, new team building exercises, things like that. It goes a long way towards impacting and developing the culture of the organization. And then the second one, while it may seem a little bit maybe over the top to say develop an enthusiasm for a lean culture, what I can share from experience is that, and I think a lot of you can relate to that, is when individuals have an opportunity to be part of a successful team and a successful project, that positive attitude, that positive energy becomes a little bit contagious. And that's what we really mean here by developing an enthusiasm for the lean culture. It's an enthusiasm for being empowered to make positive impacts on your workplace. And that is something that people take very seriously, and it's oftentimes very, very rewarding for individuals. So I don't think we can understate that side of it enough either. And so then really the last thing, we've kind of talked about, we want to create this need, we want to respond to this need, and then we want to make sure that we actually have the support system in place to respond to it successfully, right? That's kind of the role of management here. Let's create the need, let's develop our people, let's understand how we can put things in place to respond to it, and then let's make sure that we're using good data, we understand where we're going, and then through this lean office that we can create, we actually have the resources now to consistently follow through on these things. So just to kind of a summary, reinforcing this ideal thinking, and this is kind of a little bit of, gets into maybe some homework questions, but it's good to think about, especially at the top management level. And there's just kind of a couple questions here. And the first one really is, what, for you, what is organizational culture? You'll hear me talk about it a lot. I'm sure you've heard about it, heard the phrase, but what does it mean to you? And what I encourage everyone to do is kind of go back through this presentation, through some of the handouts, because the information is in there, but you've got to be able to pull it out, see what you take from it, and see what it means to you. By the same token, what's needed for a lean culture, right? So what's different when we talk about some of these management concepts and the role of management? What's different about the way management behaves in a lean culture versus a traditional one, the ones that people are more familiar with, maybe one that's the way your organization is right now? Kind of what are those key differences? It's good to pull that out and reflect on it. It's important to understand before we try and move forward. And then the last question is, how can we change culture? And this is really one of the biggest questions, and it'll be an area of great pushback in a lot of organizations when we go in to start trying to do this. And in this one in particular, based off some experiences and then doing some different things, typically what we find when we go in is if we try and force a cultural change, we try and drag people, that's when you end up with heels being put in, claws being dug into the floor, and it can really become a difficult situation relatively rapidly. What we find is that if we can create an environment where people have an opportunity to succeed, where people have an opportunity to see and touch and feel and be a part of real positive results and impacting real positive change, then that in and of itself begins to become contagious, kind of like we talked about developing that enthusiasm. And when you can do that, and when we can get to those points, and when we can engage people in a meaningful way like that, you generally start to have kind of an organic cultural change that'll just take root and take a life of its own and grow if you've got the support structures in place to kind of fan the flames and foster it. That's why that support structure is important too. So really what I encourage everybody to do is spend a couple minutes thinking about, what is culture? What is culture? And, what's the difference between the culture of my organization now and where it needs to be an effective functioning lean system? And then that last thing, reflect a little bit about if you were to go in tomorrow and wanted to try and start changing the culture. What are some of the things you would do? What are the ways you would go about it? Because those are important questions to answer and have clarity on before we kind of just jump into the middle of it. So, as always, any questions, please direct them to the website, and we will see everybody for the next section. Thank you.